The man's name was Jobst Findelen. He was a merchant in Nuremberg in the year 1444. His business was saffron. Not wool or grain or iron, but the dried red gold threads from a small purple flower. To us, it is a spice. A small, expensive jar we might buy once a year for a special dish. To Jobst Findelen in the city of Nuremberg, it was a treasure. Its value was measured against gold, and sometimes it was worth more. An ounce of saffron could buy a horse. A pound could buy a house. It was used to color the food of kings, to dye the robes of cardinals, and as a powerful medicine for everything from the plague to melancholy. The city's reputation depended on the purity of its saffron. Inspectors, the saffron shoe, checked every shipment with fierce diligence. Jobst Findelen decided to cheat. He was a clever man. He knew that adding other cheaper materials to his saffron would increase its weight. A little more weight meant a lot more money, so he mixed in threads of marigold petals. He added bits of sandalwood for color and weight. He might have even added fibers moistened with honey and oil. He sold this adulterated saffron to his customers. For a time, he got away with it. He made his profit, but someone noticed. Maybe a cook found the color was not quite right. Maybe a physician found the medicinal effect was weak. An inspection was ordered. The saffron shoe came to his warehouse. They tested his saffron. They found the fraud. The punishment for this crime was not a fine. It was not a few years in prison. In 1444, Nuremberg, tampering with saffron was an offense against the entire economic order. It was a betrayal of the city's honor. Jobst Findelen was arrested. He was tried. He was found guilty. He and the adulterated saffron he had created were taken to the public square. He was tied to a stake. The saffron was piled around him. He was burned alive. A man was executed for a spice. It is hard for us to understand. We live in a world of abundance. We can buy spices from every corner of the earth for a few dollars. But in the medieval world, the things we take for granted were the foundation of fortunes, the cause of wars, and for a man named Jobst Findelen, the reason for a terrifying death. His story is a window into that world. It shows how profoundly different life was when the simple things we use today were the most precious commodities on earth. Number 10, a man could wear his entire estate on his back. And Dmitry Fyodorov was not a prince or a boyar. He was a trader from Novgorod, and the year was 1382. His wealth was not in land, which could be taken, or in gold coins, which could be stolen. His wealth was packed onto 20 sledges pulled by strong, shaggy horses that snorted steam in the biting cold. The sledges were piled high with sacks, but the sacks did not hold grain. They held salt, iron axe heads, copper pots, and thousands of colorful glass beads from Venice. Dmitri was heading east into the vast, silent forests of the Perm-Krai, the land of the Komi people. It was a journey of hundreds of miles following frozen rivers, a journey where a wrong turn or an early thaw could mean death. He was not going there to conquer, he was going to trade. The people of the forest had something he wanted, something the lords of Novgorod and the merchants of the Hanseatic League and the kings of Europe craved more than almost anything else. They had fur. Specifically, they had sable, the small, dark animal whose pelt was so soft and lustrous it was called soft gold. When Dmitri and his men finally reached a Komi settlement, the trading began. It was a slow, careful process. He did not use money, he bartered. An iron axe head, a tool that could change a man's life in the forest, was worth 10 squirrel pelts. A copper pot was worth 20. A string of blue glass beads, which looked like frozen sky, might be worth 30. But the real prize was sable. For a single, perfect sable pelt, dark as midnight with silver-tipped hairs, Dmitri would trade a small fortune in goods. Perhaps 5 axe heads in a pot. The value was staggering. Back in Novgorod, that single pelt could be sold for enough money to feed a family for a year. As a coat made of 60 such pelts was a prince's ransom. Dmitri spent the winter trading, his pile of goods shrinking as his pile of furs grew. He gathered thousands of squirrel pelts, hundreds of marten and fox, but his true treasure was a bundle of 200 prime sable pelts. This was his profit, this was his future. The journey back was just as dangerous. He had to fend off bandits, men who knew the value of his cargo. He had to race the spring melt. When he finally saw the onion domes of Novgorod's churches, he was a wealthy man. He sold his furs at the bustling market near the Volkhov River. German traders from Lubeck and Hamburg paid him in silver ingots called grivnas. The furs would continue their journey west. The sable would end up trimming the robes of an English king or a French duke. It's meaning the pure white winter coat of the stoat, with its black-tipped tail, would line the coronation robes of emperors. These furs were not just for warmth. They were governed by strict sumptuary laws. Only certain ranks could wear certain furs. A common merchant wearing a full sable cloak could be arrested and fined. Fur was a visual language of power and status. Like, you literally wore your rank on your body. Dmitry Fyodorov, the trader, became a powerful man in Novgorod because he understood this. He risked his life for the pelts of small animals. To him, a bundle of sable was not just fur, it was a new warehouse, a bigger house, a better life for his children. Today, we have synthetic furs of every kind. Even real fur from farmed animals is a niche luxury item, often controversial. The idea of a fur coat being worth a country estate is absurd. We no longer see fur as a marker of nobility. But in 1382, for a man like Dmitri, a single dark pelt held the value of a small farm, and a sledge full of them held the power of a kingdom. Number 9. The color blue was a dangerous business. Jean de Varennes was a dyer in the city of Toulouse in 1290. He was a master of his craft. His hands were permanently stained a murky blue-gray from years of plunging woolen cloth into his vats. The source of his blue, the only source he was allowed to use, was woad. It was a leafy plant that grew in the fields all around Toulouse. The city's wealth was built on these leaves. They were crushed, fermented into pungent, foul-smelling balls, and then used to create a blue dye. The color was serviceable. It could be pale sky blue or a respectable dark navy. Jean was proud of his work. Woad had made him and his city rich, but Jean had heard whispers. He had heard stories from sailors and merchants who traveled to the great port of Genoa. They spoke of a different blue, a blue from the far-off land of India. It was called indigo. They said it produced a color so deep and vibrant that it made woad look like dishwater. They said a tiny amount of this indigo powder had the dyeing power of a huge ball of woad, and they said it was fantastically expensive. The Woad Merchants Guild, the most powerful in Toulouse, called it the devil's dye. They spread rumors that it was corrosive, that it destroyed the cloth, that its use was a damnable sin. They did this because they were terrified. Indigo was a threat to their entire existence. One day, a Genoese trader came to Jean's workshop secretly. At night, he unwrapped a small, dark, rock-like lump from an oilcloth. It was indigo. It had traveled thousands of miles on camels and ships to reach this back alley in Toulouse. The price the trader asked for was astronomical. For a lump the size of his fist, he wanted what Jean earned in 6 months. It was a huge risk. If the guild found out he was using a forbidden dye, he would be ruined. He could be expelled, his vat smashed, his name disgraced. But his curiosity, his desire as a craftsman to create the perfect blue was stronger than his fear. He paid the price. The process of using indigo was complex and mysterious. It had to be fermented in a vat of stale urine and ash. The smell was horrendous. For days, Jean tended the vat, watching the liquid turn a sickly yellow-green. When he dipped a piece of white wool into the mixture, it came out a pale, ugly yellow. For a moment, he thought he'd been cheated. He thought the devil's dye was a hoax, but then as he lifted the wool into the air, a miracle happened. The air touched the cloth and the yellow began to transform. It shifted to green, then to teal, and finally it deepened into the most astonishing, luminous, perfect blue he had ever seen. It was the color of the deep sea of the midnight sky. He used the precious dye to color a bolt of the finest wool for a wealthy nobleman. When the nobleman saw it, he was speechless. He paid Jean triple his usual fee without haggling. Soon, everyone of high standing in Toulouse wanted Varennes' blue. They did not know its secret source. Jean became wealthy, but he lived in constant fear. His fellow dyers were suspicious. They saw the impossible color of his cloths and whispered that he must be using sorcery. The Woad Guild watched him. They knew. Jean's story was repeated all over Europe for centuries. The battle between woad and indigo was a real economic war. Governments passed laws protecting their local woad industries. In Germany, the use of indigo was punishable by death. But the superiority of the color was undeniable. Slowly, inevitably, indigo won. It remained a luxury, a color for the rich for hundreds of years. And it was not until the late 19th century that chemists learned how to synthesize indigo dye from coal tar. That invention changed everything. Suddenly, this impossibly deep blue was cheap. It became the color of workwear, of denim. Today, we are surrounded by it. Blue jeans are a uniform for the entire world. We wear, without a second thought, a color that a man like Jean de Varennes once risked his life and livelihood to create. Number 8, a single book required a herd of animals. Brother Luca was a scribe. He lived and worked in the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, high on a mountain in the year 1150. His world was the scriptorium, a quiet room where the only sounds were the scratching of quills and the whisper of turning pages. His life's work was to copy books. He copied the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, the works of classical authors. It was slow, painstaking work. A single book could take him more than a year to complete, but the time it took was not the most significant factor. The most significant factor was the material he wrote on. He wrote on parchment. To make the book Luca was currently working on, a large copy of the Gospels, the monastery's tanner had to prepare the skins of 150 calves. The young animals were slaughtered, their skins were carefully flayed, washed, and scraped to remove all the hair and flesh. Then they were soaked in a lime solution for days, stretched taut on wooden frames, and scraped again and again with a curved knife until they were thin, smooth, and white. Each sheet of this vellum, as the finest calfskin was called, was a luxury item. The cost of the parchment for this one book was more than the cost of the stone needed to build a small church. The herd of animals required for a single library was immense. Luca treated his materials with reverence. Before he wrote a single word, he would rule each page with a sharp point, creating faint, invisible lines to guide his script. He mixed his own ink from oak galls and iron salts. He would write for hours, his back aching, his eyes straining in the dim light from the high windows. And if he made a mistake, he could not simply erase it. He had to carefully scrape the ink off the surface of the parchment with a knife, thinning the precious material slightly in that spot. A major error could ruin a whole page, the skin of an entire animal, a significant financial loss for the monastery. One day, a visiting merchant from Amalfi brought something new to the abbot. It was a material called paper. The merchant explained that it was made in Spain by the Moors who had learned the secret from the Chinese. It was not made from the skin of animals. It was made from mashed linen rags. It was thin, flimsy, and far, far cheaper than parchment. A stack of 100 sheets of this paper cost the same as 5 sheets of good vellum. The abbot was intrigued but suspicious. He gave a few sheets to Brother Luca to test. Luca ran his hand over the surface. It was rougher than parchment. It felt fragile and permanent. He tried his quill on it. The ink bled slightly into the fibers. It did not have the crispness, the permanence of ink on vellum. He wrote a few lines and then tried to scrape them off. The paper tore and shredded. It was useless for correction. And Luca reported back to the abbot that this new material was an inferior product. It was cheap, yes, but it would not last. A book made of paper would surely crumble to dust in 100 years, while their parchment books had already lasted for centuries. For a long time, many across Europe agreed with Brother Luca. Paper was seen as a cheap, disposable substitute for the real thing. Legal documents and important books continued to be written on parchment by law, but the economics were undeniable. As universities grew and literacy spread, the demand for books exploded. There were not enough sheep and calves in all of Europe to supply the parchment needed. Paper produced in mills that were established in Italy and then France and Germany was the only solution. The invention of the printing press in the 1450s sealed the deal. Printing on parchment was possible, but prohibitively expensive. The press needed a cheap, mass-produced medium. It needed paper. Brother Luca, in his scriptorium in 1150, could not have imagined a world where this new, flimsy material would be so abundant that people would use it to wrap fish, or write down a grocery list and then throw it away. He saw it as a threat to the permanence and value of his work. He could not see that its very cheapness would unleash an information revolution that would change the world far more than any king or emperor. We live in the world that paper built, a world of disposable information, so different from Luca's, where every page was a precious object and every book was a treasure. Number 7, to own your own face was the ultimate luxury. Though Giuseppe was a glassmaker on the island of Murano in 1485. He was not a free man, not really. He was a treasure of the Republic of Venice, and the Republic guarded its treasures jealously. He lived with his family on Murano, an island in the Venetian lagoon. He was forbidden to leave. If he tried to escape, if he was caught sharing the secrets of his craft with an outsider assassins, the Council of Ten's agents would be sent to find him and kill him. The secret he guarded was the art of making clear, flat glass mirrors. For most of human history, seeing one's own reflection clearly was nearly impossible. People saw distorted, murky versions of themselves in polished bronze, obsidian, or a still pool of water. The mirrors that existed were small, convex, and gave a warped, darkened view. But the masters of Murano had perfected a new technique. It was a complex and dangerous process. First, Giuseppe and his team of artisans would blow a large, perfect cylinder of glass. This required immense skill and lung power, working in the searing heat of the furnace. Then, while the glass was still hot, the cylinder was cut down one side and laid onto a flat, hot table, where it was carefully unrolled and flattened into a perfect sheet of clear glass known as cristallo. This in itself was a Venetian marvel, but the real secret was the backing. This was Giuseppe's specialty. In a separate, well-ventilated room, he would take the cooled, polished glass plate and pour a liquid amalgam of tin and mercury onto its surface. The mercury was a poison. Giuseppe had seen what it did to older glassmakers. He had seen their hands tremble, their teeth fall out, their minds cloud. He knew the risks he took every day. He would carefully spread the shimmering liquid metal over the glass, and then, using weights, press it down for days until the mercury had bonded perfectly with the tin, creating a flawless, highly reflective surface. The result was an object of almost magical power. A Venetian mirror did not distort. It showed you your face, your clothes, your room, exactly as it was. It was a window into a perfect reversed world, and it was worth a fortune. A mirror the size of a small book could be sold for the same price as a warhorse. A larger mirror, one that could show a person from the waist up, was a gift exchanged between kings. The French king Louis XIV later spent an astronomical sum to lure Venetian glassmakers to France to create the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, breaking the Venetian monopoly. But in Giuseppe's time, Venice was the only source. A wealthy Florentine banker commissioned a mirror from Giuseppe's workshop. It was to be 2 feet tall, an object of unheard of size and expense. The price agreed upon was enough to buy a villa with an olive grove in Tuscany. It took Giuseppe and his team a month to create it. 3 glass cylinders cracked during the blowing. 1 sheet of glass shattered during the flattening. The final piece was a masterpiece. When Giuseppe looked into it, he saw his own tired, soot-stained face with a clarity that was still unsettling to him. He was a master of a craft that allowed the richest people in the world to see themselves, yet he could never afford to own one of his own creations. Today, we are surrounded by mirrors. They are in our bathrooms, our cars, our pockets. We make them in enormous sheets that float on a bed of molten tin. The process is automated, cheap, and safe. We glance at our reflection a dozen times a day without a thought. We complain about a tiny smudge or a scratch. We have forgotten that for centuries, the simple act of seeing oneself clearly was a privilege reserved for the most powerful and wealthy people on earth. It was a luxury that men like Giuseppe were held captive to create, a magical technology that gave its owner the incredible power of owning their own face. Number 6, the threads that launched 1,000 ships. Marco, the son of a Lucchese silk merchant, did not deal in raw wool or simple linen. He dealt in light itself, woven into cloth. It was the year 1240, and the city of Lucca, in Tuscany, was one of the capitals of the European silk trade. Marco's father did not raise the worms or reel the cocoons. That secret was still jealously guarded in the Byzantine Empire and the Far East. No, Marco's father was a finisher and a weaver. He bought raw silk thread which arrived in precious bales from Constantinople or via Genoese ships from the Black Sea ports. This thread alone was worth more than its weight in silver. The journey of that thread was an epic. It began in China, a state secret for millennia. It was smuggled out, the story goes, by monks who hid silkworm eggs in their hollow bamboo staffs. It traveled along the famous Silk Road, a treacherous 4,000-mile journey on the backs of camels, passing through dozens of hands, each adding their own profit. By the time the raw silk reached the workshops of Lucca, its value was immense. In his family's workshop, Marco watched the dyers plunge the hanks of cream, colored thread into bubbling pots of dye made from crushed insects for red, exotic woods for yellow, or expensive indigo for blue. The dyed thread, now gleaming like jewels, was then taken to the weavers. The looms were complex machines requiring 2 people to operate. A young boy would sit atop the loom, painstakingly lifting and lowering the heddles to create the intricate patterns of griffins, lions, or geometric designs that Lucchese silk was famous for. A single yard of this patterned silk damask could take a team a full week to weave. Marco's job was to deal with the buyers. They were the agents of popes, emperors, and kings. They came to Lucca to buy cloth for royal wedding dresses, coronation robes, and lavish altar frontals. A single bolt of cloth, enough for 1 gown, could cost the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's wages for 10 years. The church was one of the biggest consumers, using silk for vestments that would communicate the glory of God. The nobility used it to communicate their own power. Wearing silk was a clear and unambiguous statement of wealth and status. A knight might go into battle wearing a silk tunic under his armor, not for comfort, but because it was said that a silk thread, if an arrow pierced the mail, would not break and could be used to pull the arrowhead cleanly from the wound. One day, an agent for the King of England came to commission a set of hangings for a royal bedchamber. He wanted a deep crimson silk woven with a pattern of golden lions. The order was huge. It would take Marco's family workshop and 2 others more than a year to complete. The price was staggering, enough to purchase a fleet of merchant ships. Marco saw firsthand how this single commodity, the filament produced by a small moth, drove international politics, financed wars, and built cities. The entire economy of Lucca rested on its ability to transform this expensive foreign thread into an even more expensive finished product. Later, the secret of sericulture, the raising of silkworms, did spread to Italy. The rulers of Lucca tried to guard it as jealously as the Chinese had. But silk workers, tempted by high prices, eventually fled to other Italian cities like Venice and Florence, taking the knowledge with them. The industry spread, but silk remained a supreme luxury. It was the fabric of power. Today, silk is still considered a luxury fabric, but it is an accessible one. A silk tie or a silk blouse is an affordable item for many people. We have synthetic fabrics like nylon and rayon that mimic its properties. We can buy it easily online, shipped from anywhere in the world. We have forgotten that for thousands of years, this simple thread was a geopolitical force. Men, like Marco, did not just sell cloth, they traded in a substance that was as valuable as spice and as influential as gold. A fragile thread that built empires and defined what it meant to be royal. Number 5, men died for a spice that tasted like medicine. It was 1521, and the ship was a ghost. Of the 5 ships and 270 men that had left Spain 3 years earlier under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, only one, the Victoria, limped back into the harbor of Seville. Of the crew, only 18 starving men remained. They were skeletal, weak, their skin hanging off their bones. The voyage had been a nightmare of storms, starvation, and disease. Magellan himself was dead, killed in the Philippines. But the ship's hold was full, and what it held was worth more than the lives of all the men who had died. It was full of cloves. Afonso, one of the 18 survivors, had been a simple cooper's apprentice from Lisbon before signing on to the expedition. He had dreamed of adventure and wealth. He had gotten the adventure, more terrifying than he could have imagined. Now, he was about to see the wealth. He had seen where the cloves came from. It was not a grand kingdom. It was a handful of tiny volcanic islands in the Maluku archipelago, in what is now Indonesia, the so-called Spice Islands. On these islands, and nowhere else on Earth, grew the clove trees. The air there was thick with the sweet, pungent scent of the spice. The natives used it for everything, chewing it to sweeten their breath, rubbing its oil on their bodies. To them, it was common. To Europeans, it was a treasure beyond measure. Cloves were not just a flavoring. They were a powerful medicine used to treat toothaches, aid digestion, and ward off the plague. They were a preservative, helping to mask the taste of slightly spoiled meat in a world without refrigeration. And they were a symbol of incredible wealth. A handful of cloves could buy a cow, a pound could pay a carpenter's wages for a month. The price was so high because of the journey. The cloves passed from the islanders to Malay traders, then to Indian merchants, then to Arab sailors who took them to the ports of the Red Sea. From there they were carried by caravan across the desert to Alexandria, where Venetian merchants, who held a monopoly on the trade, bought them and shipped them to Europe. At each step the price multiplied. The Venetians sold cloves for 100 times what they cost in the Spice Islands. Magellan's mission, and the mission of explorers like Vasco da Gama before him, was to cut out all those middlemen. To find a direct sea route to the source, it was a quest that cost thousands of lives and changed the map of the world. Afonso had survived that quest. He had stood on the island of Tidore and watched the crew load the Victoria with 26 tons of cloves. They had traded mirrors, knives, and cloth for the spice. What they paid was trinkets. What they received was a fortune. When the Victoria's cargo was unloaded in Seville, the profits were calculated. Even after paying for the 4 lost ships and the wages of the dead men, the profit from that single cargo of cloves was immense. It was enough to make the expedition's investors rich beyond their wildest dreams. Each of the surviving sailors, men like Afonso, received a share that set them up for life. Afonso, the cooper's apprentice, was now a wealthy man. He could buy a house, a vineyard. He would never have to work again. His wealth came from the dried, unopened flower buds of a single type of tree that grew on a few remote islands halfway around the world. Today, we buy cloves in a small glass jar at the grocery store for a few dollars. We use them to stud a holiday ham or flavor a pumpkin pie. We take their abundance for granted. We have forgotten that these small, brown, nail-shaped spices once drove men to sail into the unknown, to risk starvation and death, to circumnavigate the globe. We have forgotten that they were a prize so valuable that they fueled the age of discovery and built the foundations of global empires. Number 4, an island was traded for a spice that induced visions. On the island of Run in 1616, Peter van Delft was a worried man. He was the Dutch factor, the head agent for the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, the Dutch East India Company. His job was to buy nutmeg. Run was a tiny, insignificant speck of an island, barely 2 miles long, but it was, along with its neighboring Banda Islands, the only place on the entire planet where the nutmeg tree grew. And the Dutch wanted to control it all. Nutmeg was a spice of immense value in Europe. Like cloves, it was used in cooking and medicine. But it also had another property. In large doses, it was a hallucinogen. Some believed it could prevent the plague, and during outbreaks, the price would skyrocket to insane levels. A small bag of nutmeg in London could buy a townhouse. The VOC, a powerful corporation with its own army and navy, was determined to create a total monopoly. They wanted to be the only sellers of nutmeg, and mace, the lacy red covering of the nutmeg seed in the world, allowing them to set any price they wished. The problem for Peter was the English. A rival English trading post, led by a man named Nathaniel Corthorpe, was established on Run. The Bandanese people, who had grown and harvested nutmeg for centuries, preferred trading with the English, who they found to be more fair. This infuriated the Dutch. For years, a state of low-level war existed. Courthope and his handful of men, with the help of the local population, held off the vastly superior Dutch forces. Peter van Delft was part of a brutal system. His superiors in the VOC, men like the infamous Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, believed in total submission. They saw the Bandanese not as trading partners but as subjects, and the English as thieves. In 1621, Cohen arrived with a fleet of ships and an army. What followed was a massacre. The Dutch systematically slaughtered, enslaved, or drove away almost the entire population of the Banda Islands, which was estimated to be around 15,000 people. They executed the village elders, they destroyed the native groves, and replanted them with their own nutmeg trees worked by slaves. They created their monopoly through genocide. Peter witnessed this. He saw the villages burn. He saw the consequences of his company's greed. He was a merchant, not a soldier, but he was part of the machine that committed these atrocities, all for control of a fragrant brown seed. The English were finally driven out. The Dutch now had their monopoly. They took extreme measures to protect it. No one was allowed to take a nutmeg seedling off the islands. Every nutmeg sold in Europe was first dipped in lime to ensure it could not be germinated. The rivalry with the English continued elsewhere. For decades, the two nations fought over trade and territory around the globe. In 1667, this long conflict was temporarily settled with the Treaty of Breda. As part of the treaty, a swap was made. The Dutch agreed to give up their claim to a remote, swampy island in North America that they had settled, an island called Manhattan. In return, the English gave up their claim to the tiny island of Run, giving the Dutch their complete and total control over the world's nutmeg supply. At the time, it seemed like a good deal for the Dutch. They had traded a muddy outpost for the key to their priceless nutmeg monopoly. Today, nutmeg trees are grown in many parts of the world. The monopoly was eventually broken when a Frenchman smuggled some seedlings to Mauritius. The spice is cheap and common. We grate it into eggnog or sprinkle it on custards. The island of Manhattan became the center of global finance and culture, home to New York City, arguably the most valuable piece of real estate in the world. The idea that it was once considered a fair trade for a tiny island that produced a baking spice seems unbelievable. But in the 17th century, the value of things was different. Spices were the oil of their day, and men like Peter van Delft were on the front lines of a vicious global conflict, fighting and killing for a small, wrinkled seed that promised unimaginable wealth. Number 3. The white grains that rotted a queen's teeth. When Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, attended a feast in the Crusader state of Antioch in 1148, she encountered something she had only heard of in hushed, exotic terms. It was served in small, precious bowls to be used sparingly. It was a white, granular substance with a purely sweet taste. It was sugar. In Europe at the time, the only common sweetener was honey. Fruits provided some sweetness, but the intense, clean sweetness of sugar was a revelation. It was known as an Indian salt or Arabian powder. It came from a tall grass sugarcane that grew in the hot lands of the East. The process of extracting and refining it was a closely guarded secret of the Arab world. It was imported into Europe by Venetian and Genoese merchants in tiny quantities and sold at exorbitant prices. It was not treated as a food. It was sold by apothecaries as a medicine. Doctors prescribed it for coughs, chest ailments, and to improve the humors. A king might receive a small sugar loaf, a hard, conical lump of refined sugar, as a diplomatic gift. It was kept in a locked spice cabinet along with pepper and saffron. Eleanor was captivated. She and the other crusading nobles brought a taste for sugar back to Europe. The demand grew, but the supply was still tiny. The Venetians grew rich by controlling the trade. They established their own sugarcane plantations on the islands of Crete and Cyprus, using a system of forced labor that was a forerunner to the slave plantations of the New World. Sugar was a rich man's game. By the 15th century, sugar began to shift from medicine to confection. Wealthy Italian courts would display their power with elaborate sugar sculptures called trionfi at their banquets. They would create castles, animals, and mythological scenes, all molded from pure white sugar. This was the ultimate expression of conspicuous consumption. You were creating beautiful, expensive art out of a rare commodity, only to have it broken up and eaten at the end of the feast. A pastry chef named Giovanni, working for the Duke of Ferrara in the 1490s, might spend months designing and executing the sugar sculptures for a single wedding feast. He would use pounds of sugar, a substance that cost more per ounce than the wages of the man who was molding it. The sugar itself had to be pounded into a fine powder from the hard loaf, mixed with gum tragacanth to make it pliable, and then carefully shaped. The single collapsed sugar tower was a financial disaster. The real revolution came when Christopher Columbus carried sugarcane from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean on his second voyage in 1493. The climate was perfect. The crop flourished. This was the beginning of the great sugar boom. The Portuguese started vast plantations in Brazil, the Spanish in Cuba, and the English, French, and Dutch in the islands of the West Indies. To work these plantations, they needed a huge labor force. This led to one of the darkest chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were captured, shipped across the ocean in horrific conditions, and forced to work and die in the sugar fields and boiling houses. The immense profits from this slave-produced sugar transformed Europe. It fueled the Industrial Revolution. It created a new class of super rich merchants and planters, and it slowly transformed from a luxury of kings to a commodity for the masses. By the 18th century, even working class people in England could afford sugar to put in their tea. It became an addiction, a source of cheap calories for the new factory workforce. This Queen Elizabeth, I was famously fond of sugar, and by the end of her life, her teeth had turned black and rotten from it, a common problem among the sugar-eating aristocracy. Today, sugar is in almost everything we eat. It is so cheap and abundant that we see it as a public health problem, a cause of obesity and diabetes. We are told to consume less of it. We have forgotten that for centuries it was a rare and precious medicine, a symbol of royal power, and the driving force behind a global system of slavery and exploitation. A substance so valuable that it reshaped the world, built fortunes, and destroyed millions of lives, all for a moment of sweetness on the tongue. Number 2, the white rocks that paid for armies. Marek was born in the village of Weliczka near Krakow in 1310. He never saw the sun on a workday. From the age of 12, he was lowered hundreds of feet into the earth each morning in a large bucket down into the darkness of the salt mine. His world was a maze of wooden beamed tunnels and vast underground chambers lit by the flickering, smoky light of tallow lamps. The air was dry and salty. His job was to chip away at the walls with a small pick. The walls were not dirt or stone. They were solid, crystalline rock salt. In the 14th century, salt was not just a seasoning for food. It was a strategic necessity. Before refrigeration, salt was the primary way to preserve food. Meat and fish could be salted to last through the long winter months. Armies on the march depended on salted rations. Without salt, society could not function. And because it was so essential, it was heavily controlled and taxed. Rulers across Europe understood that whoever controlled the salt controlled the people. The word salari comes from the Latin word sala for salt, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. The salt from the Weliczka mine was special. It was rock salt, purer, and more valuable than the sea salt produced by evaporating seawater in coastal pans. The mine was the property of the King of Poland, Casimir the Great. It was the kingdom's single greatest source of revenue. The profits from the mine paid for the construction of Wall Castle in Krakow, funded the new university, and paid the wages of the king's armies. The mine was quite literally the foundation of the Polish kingdom's power and wealth. Marek's life was hard and dangerous. The cave-ins were a constant threat. The methane gas that seeped from the salt, which the miners called the dragon, could explode with a single spark. He worked a long shift, his body caked in salt dust, his hands raw and calloused. For his labor, he was paid a small wage and given a portion of salt, which he could use to barter for other goods in the village market. A block of salt could be traded for bread, for a pair of shoes, for a chicken. In some places, salt was used as currency, just like gold or silver. The salt he and the other miners chipped from the walls was hauled to the surface not by men, but by horses that lived their entire lives underground in subterranean stables. Once on the surface, the salt was shaped into large cylindrical blocks, called balwani, each weighing up to a ton. These were then transported along the Vistula River and overland to be sold across Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia. Merchants grew rich trading this. White gold. Wars were fought over control of salt-producing regions. The common people often resented the high salt taxes, the gabelle in France being one of the most hated taxes, a contributing cause of the French Revolution centuries later. The miners in Weliczka developed a unique culture deep within the earth. To pass the time and express their faith, they began to carve the salt. They carved chapels out of the rock, complete with altars, statues of saints, and even chandeliers with salt crystal pendants. The most famous of these, the Chapel of St. Kinga, is a breathtaking underground cathedral, a testament to the artistry of generations of simple miners like Marek. They worked in a place of immense economic value, a place of darkness and danger, and they created a place of stunning beauty. Today, we buy a container of salt for less than $1. We complain if our food is too salty. We have iodized salt, sea salt, Himalayan pink salt, a dozen different varieties available in any supermarket. It is the cheapest and most common of household goods. We have completely forgotten its former power. We cannot imagine a world where a simple mineral, the same one we sprinkle on our fries, was a strategic commodity on par with oil today. a source of royal fortunes, a cause of political unrest, and the life's work of men like Merrick, who spent their lives in darkness chipping away at the wealth of nations. Number one, the ransom of a city was measured in peppercorns. In the year 408, the city of Rome was in trouble. Alaric, king of the Goths, had his armies surrounding the ancient capital of the world. The city was starving. The people were desperate. The Roman Senate sent envoys to negotiate with Alaric to ask his price for lifting the siege. They offered him gold, silver, and precious silks. Alaric considered their offer. He then gave them his terms. He demanded 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 hides dyed scarlet, and finally, 3,000 pounds of pepper. The Roman envoys were stunned by the last item on the list. Gold and silver were understandable, but pepper? They asked Alaric what he would leave the citizens of Rome if he took so much of their wealth. He famously replied, "There lives." The Senate had no choice. They stripped the gold from pagan statues and melted down silver ornaments to meet the demand. And they gathered the pepper. The fact that a barbarian king besieging the greatest city in the world would demand pepper as a major part of his ransom shows its incredible value. Now, it was not just a spice, it was a form of concentrated, portable wealth, as good as any precious metal. Where did this power come from? Pepper came from one place, the Malabar coast of southern India. It grew on a vine. The dried berries we know as peppercorns. For centuries, its origin was shrouded in mystery. Traders told fantastic stories of it being guarded by fiery dragons and serpents to keep others from finding the source and to justify the high prices. The pepper was harvested and sold to Arab traders who carried it by ship across the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea. From there, it was hauled by camel caravan to Alexandria, where it was loaded onto ships bound for Venice or Genoa. Pietro, a Venetian merchant in the 13th century, built his entire fortune on pepper. His life revolved around the pepper fleets, the convoys of ships that made the dangerous journey to the east each year. A single voyage, if successful, could make him and his investors a fortune, but the risks were enormous. Ships could be lost to storms or pirates. A man could invest his entire life savings in a cargo of pepper, only to have the ship sink in the Mediterranean, ruining him overnight. When the pepper arrived in Venice, it was stored in state-controlled warehouses. The price was carefully managed. A single peppercorn was a valuable item. A dockworker's daily wage might only be enough to buy a few of them. Rents were sometimes paid in peppercorns. A man's wealth might be described by his pepper sack, a term for a rich merchant. Pepper was used to season food, of course, but its strong taste was also essential for preserving meat and masking the flavor of food that was beginning to spoil. It was also considered a powerful medicine, believed to cure a wide range of ailments. Its value was driven by this combination of culinary use, medicinal properties, and sheer rarity. Pietro would sell his pepper to traders from across Europe who would then transport it overland through the Alpine passes into Germany, France, and England. At every stage of the journey, the price increased. A pound of pepper that cost 1 ducat in Alexandria might sell for 40 ducats in London. This immense profitability is what drove the age of exploration. The Portuguese and later the Spanish and Dutch were obsessed with finding a direct sea route to India to bypass the Arab-Venetian monopoly. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage around Africa to India in 1498 was a turning point in world history. It broke the Venetian hold on the spice trade and shifted the center of global power, and it was all because of the European craving for these tiny, dried berries. Today, pepper sits on nearly every dining table in the world, right next to the salt. It is the world's most traded spice, but it is cheap. We grind it onto our food with barely a thought. We would find it laughable to pay a debt with a handful of peppercorns. We have forgotten that this humble spice was once so precious that it was counted out berry by berry, that it was locked away like jewels, that it was used to pay the ransom of Rome, and that it launched the fleets of ships that connected the globe and forever changed the course of history.